Roof's done except for cedar shakes. I realize that next month it'll be 4 years since I hauled the first log out of the bush and peeled it when we started the Cedar Hollow Tavern. Since then we've almost completed the blockhouse, the blacksmith shop, gunsmith or gun building shops coming along. There's a few small things to do, so the powder magazine and a beehive oven. But it's getting close, and it's at times been rather daunting. It's been quite a long road to hoe, but I stayed the course. And I got thinking today about people that really, truly stayed the course, and I'm not trying to compare myself to her, but I'm going to do my wee bit of history today on Abigail Adams, who earned the nickname of Mrs. President, and rightfully so. And she was most definitely one of America's most ardent patriots. I'm going to get the heck out of this sun, and I'll tell my wee bit of history. I do my history by the hearth, always in the tavern, but now I've got a second hearth completed. So a little warm to fire it up to see if it works today, but it's done. The last stone went on day before yesterday. And anyway, a wee bit of history about Abigail Adams. In my youth, when I was studying history, I always found it rather frustrating that we had to learn all these supposed significant dates in history and then regurgitate them on exams. And I'm sure a lot of people that have studied history found that frustrating as well. But sometimes we need dates to put things into context. So Abigail was born in the state of Massachusetts on November the 22nd, 1744, and she died of typhoid fever October 28th, 1818. And so she lived through the French and Indian Wars, she lived through the American Revolution, obviously, and she lived through the War of 1812. And she was an absolutely remarkable woman. Abigail's father, Reverend William Smith, was a very well-respected person in the state of Massachusetts. He also had a huge library, and he firmly believed in educating his children regardless of their gender. And if we think about the 18th century, that was kind of frowned upon. They wanted women to have some basic things. To read was fine, decipher, to go to the market to buy food and such. That was all good. But beyond that, Abigail was a ferocious reader, and she immersed herself in philosophy, theology, history, languages, and that was not afforded the average woman in that time period. And this would seriously influence her views on women's rights, on women's education, basically the social status of women of that era. Had the Founding Fathers taken some of her advice a little bit earlier, a lot of conflicts that will ultimately take place in the United States of America, the new country, might very well have been avoided. When I'm thinking about things that may have been avoided, I think the biggest one potentially could have been the entire civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s. So 200 plus years later, this becomes a huge issue because she did not believe in the institution of slavery. Now, the family did own slaves as a child. Her father apparently owned 4 slaves, but she would grow to hate the institution. She also strongly believed in women's right for property. Now, she never got as far as saying women should have a vote, because I think in her mind, and I'm sure it was in her mind, but I think she thought that's way too radical for the time period. And it would have been. Just the fact that she was such a free-thinking, speaking woman in itself was. So in 1764, she marries John Adams. And if you're a researcher of history, we all know it's difficult to find first-person accounts, but we are blessed with the Adams family in the sense that most of their letters have survived. Their partnership was certainly one of intellectual equals, and again, almost unheard of at the time. And the letters give us a lot of insight into what was going through their lives at the time, what was happening in the revolution or build up to the revolution. And they were both fervent supporters for American independence. And there were a lot of letters written because there were a lot of absences when John got involved in the political arena and away from the law firm. And while he's away, and all these times he's away, again, showing her ability to not only keep the household, raise the children, run a farm, she also was able to invest money, became fairly wealthy, and continued to be a very outspoken person for American independence. So we know Abigail is best remembered for her advocacy for women's rights, and probably the most famous letter and one of her more famous quoted quotes, if you would. She wrote a letter on March 31st, 1776 to John. Now John is with a group of fellows and they're trying to draft the Declaration of Independence at the time. And she writes to him, I'll try to do this verbatim, "Remember the ladies and be more favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands." Sadly, the Abigail's plea for women's rights goes unheard of. It's just simply too radical for the time. But that gives you some insight into the woman and where she was coming from. Sadly, the famous document is going to say all men are created equal. And really all Abigail was advocating for was that women would have a much stronger role in this new republic. I mean, this is revolutionary at the time. They're breaking free for the first time from monarchy. They're going to have a voting system where they elect their representatives. And that was her effort to try to get women into a more powerful role. And it wasn't just rhetoric on her part. As I mentioned, she's running the farm, she's tending the kids, so she's taken on the traditional role in the 18th century, what was considered simply a man's job, not a woman's job. In addition to her advocacy for female rights, she was a strong opponent to the institution of slavery, and her letters reflect that. In her mind, it simply went against the grain of freedom and justice, the very things that the revolution in America was trying to stand for. Allow me to read one of her quotes, because I don't want to, if I try to just do it off the top of my head, it may not come out, because I think it's really significant. And she says in a letter to John, "I wish most sincerely that there was not a slave in the province. It always seemed to me to fight ourselves for what we are robbing the Negroes of, who have as good of rights to freedom as we have." And I found that one one of the more profound quotes, and there are many. Abigail knew full well that her idea of ending the institution of slavery was way too radical for the time. But what she proposed was that a gradual elimination of the entire institution. And her views would eventually and strongly influence John Quincy Adams, who becomes her son, her oldest son, who becomes the 6th president of the United States. And he became an avid abolitionist who fought tirelessly his entire political career to end the institution of slavery. So now we get to John Adams becoming the 2nd president of the United States. It's only going to be a one-term presidency, and it is full of turmoil. One of his best friends, Thomas Jefferson, and him have such opposite views of how this new nation should govern itself that they have a total falling out. In fact, Abigail, who corresponded with him, Jefferson that is, most of her life, quits corresponding with him for 10 plus years and reconnects when his daughter, nicknamed Polly, died. In fact, Abigail at one point in time actually helped raise Polly. but they're constantly under attack, and never one to hold her tongue. She once said, I expect to be vilified and abused, was one of the comments she wrote. But people are now starting to intercept their letters and publish them. John is under constant attack, and Abigail is constantly defending her husband in his stance. It is a very rough presidency. And one has to think, too, that the way the institution worked at the time, that the two people that were vying for the presidency when John is elected was himself and Thomas Jefferson. Now, under the rules of the day, Thomas Jefferson immediately becomes his vice president. Now imagine how that would work when you have such opposing views. There is a tremendous amount written about the venerated founding fathers of America. But what of the women, I say? So we've got Deborah Franklin, Martha Washington, Martha Jefferson, Eliza Hamilton, the list goes on. And that old saying, behind every great man there is a great woman. Well, definitely Abigail is up there in my books, and historians would say probably the best first lady that America ever had. So I'll leave you with a couple of quotes, and I have a lot of quotes in my head. It's retrieval. Sometimes it's difficult, so I thought I'd jot these ones down. They're two of my favorite ones. And one says, "If particular attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." Sounds kind of familiar to the... I'm not so sure she didn't draft those famous documents. And the one that really strikes a chord with me and tickles me pink is there's a long absence between 1778 and 1783, when prior to his presidency, and he's in Europe. The peace treaties are going on and what have you. And she writes, "Alas, how many snowbanks divide me and thee." It was truly, as I mentioned earlier, a relationship of equals, intellectual equals, but it was a love relationship these two had, and I think I respect that as much as I respect the lady. And yeah, now that I've had my sit down, I've had my cup of coffee, I have a gun building shop to finish, so I think I'll get at some work.